In the winter of 1841, when the Cumberland River lay like a blade of dull pewter beneath the leafless hickories, the carriage from Magnolia Reach was seen only once after twilight, its lacquered panels drinking the moonlight until they shone the color of dried blood. Two house girls, sent to fetch kindling from the riverside, told the cook they had heard the wheels stop above the high bank, heard the brake shoe squeal like a frightened pig, and then no voices, no footfalls, only the soft repeated thud of something heavy being dragged across the frosted grass. One girl said the sound was wet, as though a freshly slaughtered carcass were being pulled by a hook. The other, older and schooled by slavery to distrust her own eyes, insisted it was only a carpet rolled tight. They agreed on one detail, that the something left a broad, dark stripe that gleamed for an instant before the cold earth drank it in. When the carriage returned before dawn, the trace rims were rimed with river silt, and the left door swung open to reveal only a single satin slipper, gray with dust, the heel crushed inward as if a mouth had tried to bite through the kid leather. The driver, a yellow man called Plato, who had been born on the place and could neither read nor write yet, could recite the pedigree of every horse in the stable, stared straight ahead while the overseer took the slipper away on the tip of his whip. No one asked questions. On Magnolia Reach, questions were a form of currency, more dangerous than gold, and poorer men had been sold south for spending less. But the next morning the bell in the yard rang 3 minutes late, and every slave who lifted his head from the pallet knew that the daughter, Miss Aurelia, the wide, pale girl who had to be hoisted into her chair with block and tackle, was nowhere to be found. The story that would travel downriver for decades began not with a scream, but with that hush, the hush of a house too practiced in silence to break its own rules, even when the heiress vanished and left only a ruined shoe. Magnolia Reach had been assembled 40 years earlier by Colonel Lucius Harlan, who rode out of Virginia with a warrant for 20,000 acres and a reputation for winning card games whose stakes were measured in human flesh. He chose the Loess Bluff above the Cumberland because the soil was the color of wound scab and because the river bent there like an arm crooked to receive tribute. By the time Aurelia was born in 1820, the place had become a small nation, whose constitution was written in whip-seared backs, whose anthem was the creak of the cotton press, screwing downward until the bales squealed. The big house was built of tulip poplar sawn on the spot, each beam sleeved in poplar so that the walls appeared to sweat gold in lamplight. Yet the cellars were quarried into the bluff itself, stone corridors that stayed the same temperature as a grave the whole year round. Colonel Harlan's only legitimate child, Aurelia, had at birth already weighed 11 pounds, her cheeks so swollen with blood they looked bruised, and the midwife whispered that the infant had grown too fast inside the mother, as though she had been fed on meat left too long in the rain. By her 10th year she could not climb the staircase without 2 servants wedging their shoulders beneath her arms. By her 15th, she had to be sewn into her gowns because no amount of lacing could close the breadth of bone that spread like a yoke across her back. Visitors, those who still accepted invitations, pretended not to notice the iron ring bolted to the dining room floor beneath the carpet, the ring to which a chain was quietly fastened when she sat down to eat, preventing the chair from sliding backward under the ponderous accumulation of her weight. Her father, who had begun to speak of her as the investment that devours itself, kept a ledger column titled Aurelia, Feed, and another titled Aurelia, Waste, and the second had begun to outstrip the first. The plantation's history was already a palimpsest of disappearances. In 1819, a field hand named Ransom had run away twice, After the second recapture, he was tethered in the smokehouse and the door left unlatched so that the hounds could be loosed on him at intervals. When the men entered at dawn, they found only a pile of clothes folded as neatly as if for church, and a scatter of black hairs that might have been singed off by the smoldering hickory chips. In 1825, the overseer's wife, a gaunt Pennsylvania woman who drank laudanum to still the tremor in her hands, walked into the orchard at dusk and was never seen again. Her shawl was found caught on a persimmon twig 20 feet above the ground, the knot still tight as though she had risen straight into the air. Each incident was entered into the Plantation book in the same ink that recorded bale weights and hog slaughter, the handwriting never wavering, as though the world itself were an account that must balance in the end. Yet the balances never closed. They only rolled forward, accruing interest measured in the currency of silence. By the time Aurelia vanished, the local county, whose name ironically was Hopewell, had long since learned to speak of Magnolia Reach in the tone used for graveside prayers, a tone that suggested the earth itself might open if pressed too hard. The problem, when it finally showed its face, wore the features of a man named Jacob, slave of the third generation, blacksmith, 5 feet 10 inches tall, whose back carried the lattice of scars that passed for a birth certificate. Jacob had been trained in the forge that stood at the margin of the cornfields, a square brick cave whose chimney leaned like a man trying to overhear a secret. There he shaped the iron that shackled his own kind, neck rings, ankle cuffs, the tiny bells riveted to runaways so their movements would jingle like sleigh rides across the frozen quarters. He had a wife once, Delia, who died of a fever that left her skin the color of mustard flowers, and a daughter sold south at 9, so that by 1841 he possessed only the memory of voices, and even those had begun to rust. Aurelia had noticed him first when she was 20, and he was called to the big house to fit a restraining bar to her bed frame. She watched him through the gauze of her mosquito netting while he knelt, the muscles of his arms sliding beneath the sooty skin like cords being drawn through water. Something passed between them that had no name on the plantation, a look that was not invitation nor defiance, but the mutual recognition of two creatures harnessed to the same invisible millstone. After that day she requested his labor for every broken hinge, every jammed lock, until the requests became a schedule, and the schedule became a rumor that drifted across the quarters like the smell of rendering lard. The overseer noted that Jacob's weekly ration of pork fat increased by a quarter pound. The cook noted that Aurelia's plate, returned untouched, bore the imprint of a single tooth, wide and square, as though a bite had been considered and then abandoned. The descent began with small derangements, the kind that could still be blamed on weather or indigestion. In October, the dairy yielded butter that would not lighten, remaining the shade of old pewter even after 3 hours of churning. When tasted, it carried the sourness of river-bottom silt. The colonel's favorite mare, a blood bay that had carried him through the Creek War, began to scream at dusk, a sound like a saw drawn across bone, until one morning she was found in her stall, kneeling in straw soaked with urine, her eyes rolled back to the silver membrane beneath. Aurelia's appetite, once a household expense that eclipsed the preacher's salary, dwindled to nothing. Yet her body continued to swell, the skin stretching tight until the veins showed through like indigo threads stitched by a drunken seamstress. The seamstress herself, a quadroon named Celeste, who could read patterns the way priests read entrails, refused after a single fitting to enter the mistress's chamber again. She told the yard girl that the room smelled of meat left too close to the hearth, a smell that clung to the back of the throat and made her think of the pigs she had seen split open while still alive. Meanwhile, Jacob's forge began to burn at night, its glow visible across the quarters like a second moon risen to mock the first. Slaves passing on the path reported hearing a single hammer striking an anvil, yet the rhythm was wrong, too slow, as though each blow waited for permission from some deeper pulse beneath the soil. When the overseer investigated, he found the forge cold, ashes white as bone meal, but the scent of hot iron lingered, and the largest anvil bore a print of 5 fingers melted into the metal, as though a hand had been pressed there in greeting. In November, the first disappearance touched the big house itself. A lady's maid named Hannah, who had been Aurelia's companion since childhood, and who could still recall when the girl's wrists had been small enough to circle with thumb and forefinger, vanished between the sewing room and the pantry. Her apron was found folded on the mahogany sideboard, the pocket containing a thimble and a length of crimson thread knotted 9 times. An old quarter custom meant to bind the tongue of anyone who spoke ill of the dead. The colonel ordered the river dragged. The men who waded into the icy water came out with their legs streaked red as though grazed by barnacles, though the Cumberland had no salt. 3 nights later, the cook woke to find the kitchen door ajar and a trail of wet footprints leading from the hearth toward the stair that ascended to Aurelia's wing. The prints were enormous, longer than any man's, and the toes splayed wide as if whatever made them had walked barefoot across the bottom of the river itself. The cook followed with a tallow candle that hissed in the draught. At the landing the prints ended, but the banister rail was warm to the touch, and a single hair, pale, almost colorless, thick as sewing thread, was caught on a splinter. She did not speak of it. She wrapped the hair in a rag and buried it beneath the ash heap. But the next morning her right hand, the one that had brushed the banister, was swollen and mottled as though stung by 100 invisible wasps. By December, Aurelia no longer left her chamber. The shutters stayed bolted, yet servants passing in the corridor heard a slow creaking, the sound of rope taking strain, accompanied by a softer noise like dough being punched down in a kneading trough. The colonel sent for a physician from Nashville, a man who had studied in Edinburgh and who arrived with a case of lancets and a theory of humors. He emerged after an hour, white as paper, his cravat untied, and refused payment. In the carriage he told his driver that the room had smelled of the dissecting theater at Surgeons' Hall, yet the subject was still alive, if life could be said to inhabit what he had seen. He left behind a bottle of mercury pills and a recommendation that windows be opened to encourage the departure of miasma. But the pills were found weeks later, each one bitten in half as though by teeth too large to swallow them whole. The colonel, whose own breathing had begun to whistle at night like steam escaping a cracked kettle, took to walking the veranda with a loaded pistol, though he could not say what he meant to shoot. Once, at moonset, he fired at a shadow that slipped along the edge of the boxwood maze. The ball struck brick and whined away, but the shadow neither quickened nor slowed, and in the morning the gardeners found a trail of something viscous that killed the grass it touched, leaving a path the width of a door. The horror, when it could no longer be contained within the house, spilled outward like floodwater, seeking its level. On Christmas Eve, the quarters were searched for a boy named Ezekiel, 10 years old, light enough to be carried off by a hawk if hawks hunted at night. His mother had woken to find the straw pallet beside her empty, but the coverlet was still warm and indented as though the child had been lifted straight upward. In the dust beside the cabin door were prints identical to those in the big house kitchen, long splayed, toe marks edged with the same river silt. The overseer organized a party armed with dogs and torches. They followed the trail through the canebrake to the forge, where the coals were banked but breathing. On the anvil lay a single object, a collar forged from light iron, sized not for a man nor for a woman, but for something whose neck would be thicker than either. The inner edge lined with felt that had once been scarlet, but was now the color of dried liver. The collar was still warm, and when the blacksmith striker lifted it with tongs, the felt peeled away in a single sheet, revealing beneath a line of small punctures, each the width of a darning needle, arranged in a circle as neat as the perforations on a theater ticket. No one claimed knowledge of the forging, yet the iron carried Jacob's mark, the tiny cross struck on every piece that left his hearth. When questioned, he said only that iron remembered what hands refused to, and that some commissions arrived in dreams. 3 nights later, the sky thawed and the river rose, carrying with it a scum of ice and uprooted saplings. At first light, the lookout on the bluff saw something caught in the bend below the sandbar, a mass pale enough to reflect the early sun, rounded like the carcass of a steer, yet moving gently with the current as though still possessed of volition. When the men waded out, they found it was not one body but 2, though the 2 were joined in a manner that made the youngest overseer retch into the water. The larger corpse was Aurelia, naked, the skin split along the belly so that the inner lining protruded like a parasol turned inside out by wind. Beneath her, folded into the cavity as neatly as a letter slipped inside an envelope, lay Jacob, also naked, his limbs arranged in the posture of a child asleep. The flesh where they touched had begun to fuse, not by heat, but by some slower chemistry that turned skin to skin the way ivy binds to brick. Where the seam was most complete, the pigment had vanished, leaving a junction the color of uncooked dough. The faces were turned toward each other, mouths open as if sharing a single breath that had finally run out. When the men tried to separate them, the tissue tore with the sound of damp cloth ripping, and a fluid the color of pale tea spilled into the river and was carried away. Aurelia's eyes were gone, the sockets filled with river gravel sized and sorted as though by a jeweler. Jacob's remained, wide and yellow, reflecting the sky like twin pieces of polished amber. Around the joined bodies the water was warm, though ice still floated a yard away, and the fish would not approach, circling instead in a slow, wary orbit, as though kept at bay by an invisible net. They were buried the same day in the family plot, though the colonel insisted the bodies be sewn into tarred canvas and lowered without ceremony, and that the grave be dug twice the usual depth. No marker was set, yet within a week the earth above them had begun to swell, not downward as graves settle, but upward like bread left to rise in a warm kitchen. "Frost heaves," the overseer said, though frost does not usually pulse in rhythmic increments, and does not produce, when probed with an iron rod, a hollow thunk like that returned by a sealed cask. By February the mound stood higher than a man's waist, and the colonel ordered it leveled. The slaves who swung picks came away complaining that the soil was soft as sponge and warm enough to steam, and that their tools returned coated with a slime that stank of river bottom and iron. 3 days later, one of the diggers, a man named Cato, failed to wake. His mouth was found packed with the same fine gravel that had filled Aurelia's eyes, and his tongue was gone, not cut but absorbed, as though the flesh itself had been transmuted into stone. Spring arrived early that year, bringing with it a fog that lingered until noon and left the leaves coated in a film the color of old pewter. The big house stood empty. The colonel had taken to his bed with a fever that dried his lips to parchment and made him speak in a voice not his own, a voice thick and slow as if dragged across gravel. On the last night he rose alone, walked barefoot across the frosted grass, and was found at dawn kneeling beside the swollen grave, his pistol unfired beside him, his mouth black with earth. The burial was swift. The mound already waited, wide enough to accept another tenant without the labor of fresh digging, and the earth closed over him with a sigh that several bystanders later swore they had heard, a sound like a mouth closing after the final word of a long story. The plantation passed by legal degrees into the hands of creditors, then into the hands of strangers who arrived with new seed and new ledgers, and who spoke of crop rotation and moral improvement. The quarters were raised, the cabins replaced by neat white cottages for sharecroppers who worked the same rows their parents had hood in bondage. Yet the big house remained unoccupied. Every buyer backed out after the first night, complaining of dreams in which a vast shape leaned over the bed, breathing river water onto their faces, or of footsteps that crossed the veranda at the hour when the moon reached its zenith, and the river paused in its course as though listening. By 1850, the place had become a rookery for crows. By 1860, the roof had fallen in, and Virginia creeper had knitted the doorway into a green veil that trembled even when the air was still. Travelers who took the river road after dark spoke of a light that bobbed along the bluff, neither lantern nor firefly, and of a sound like iron being struck underwater, muffled yet persistent, the heartbeat of some forge whose fuel was not wood, but memory itself. The story survives in fragments. A collar of light iron displayed in a Nashville museum, its felt lining gone, the inner rim pocked with holes no docent can explain. A journal kept by the Presbyterian minister, its final pages excised with a blade that left only the phrase, "They are not two, but one," repeated until the ink ran dry. A tradition among the rivermen of burying their dead with a silver coin between the teeth, a custom they cannot date but refuse to abandon. And on certain nights, when the fog rises off the Cumberland and the air smells of iron and wet stone, fishermen claim they can hear the slow creak of rope, the sound of something vast being hoisted or lowered. They cannot tell which. If they wait long enough, they see the water part around a sandbar that is not usually there, and for an instant, the moonlight reveals two shadows fused at the center, turning slowly, as if lashed to the same mill wheel, their mouths open to share a single breath that will never again run out. The river carries the image away before they can be certain, leaving only the echo of that breath, a sound like a door closing softly in a house whose rooms have no walls and whose occupants have no names.